Hello, and welcome to our session, Designing for Equity and Inclusion. My name is Michelle Gilliard, Director of U.S. Education Workforce at FHI 360. FHI 360 is a global human development organization working to improve the health and well-being of people in the United States and around the globe. In support of our commitment to increasing equitable health, education, employment outcomes in the U.S., our work is in and with marginalized and under-resourced communities. For several years, our National Institute of Work and Learning has led the Compass Rose Collaborative, a Department of Labor-funded initiative currently operating across 11 communities in 8 states. Compass Rose helps justice-involved youth ages 18 to 24 successfully transition from the justice system back into society through educational and career pathways that prepare young people for adulthood and long-term success. Through the technical assistance and guidance we provide employers, post-secondary and community-based partners as members of the Second Chance ecosystem operating within our Compass Rose communities, the young adults participating in our 2017 cohort had a recidivism rate of less than 3%. More than 70% were placed in long-term education employment or apprenticeships, and more than 70% obtained an industry-recognized credential. Through our work with these young people, a majority of whom are African-American Latino, we've learned how much they want to give back and support other young adults just like themselves. In response, we recently created a youth development professional apprenticeship. This is a registered apprenticeship which provides young people with a clear path into employment opportunities where they can develop and hone their skills, mindsets, and behaviors that will aid them in any career field, as many of the associated skills and competencies are aligned with most entry-level positions. When the apprenticeship is delivered by our youth-serving organizations, our Compass Rose participants will also leverage their experiences with the justice system, thus functioning as experts to help guide and counsel other young people to choose a different path. Through Compass Rose, we are helping young people gain access and succeed in educational and career pathways that can help build a more diverse and inclusive workforce. As our country's demographics continue to evolve, I believe it's in our collective interest to build a more equitable and inclusive workforce that provides access to family sustainable wages. This ensures that people can support themselves and their families, in addition to having resources to contribute to their communities from the local to the national level. Today's conversation will explore a variety of perspectives and strategies for building a more equitable and inclusive workforce. As our communities begin to open up and emerge from the lockdowns associated with the pandemic, it's important that we build a post-COVID workforce that intentionally includes people who heretofore have been left behind. I'm particularly talking about people of color across age groups, gender identity, disability status, country of origin, as well as justice-involved individuals. With that, I'm going to ask our 3 distinguished panelists to introduce themselves and provide a brief overview of your organization's commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and specifically share why this is important for the populations you support. Lisa, let's begin with you.
Hi, it's so great to be with you, Michelle and Katie and Alex, for this really important conversation. At AARP Foundation, our vision is a country free of poverty where no older person feels vulnerable. And our specific mission is to create and advance effective solutions so that low-income older adults can secure the essentials. So when you think about that, workforce is a centerpiece to increasing income for vulnerable older adults. Everything that we do is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But as we, as a community at AARP Foundation, have been looking at the impact of the convergence of pandemics, COVID-19, economic downturn, the long-standing pandemic of systemic racism and discrimination, we wanted to be sure that we were building into our strategic plan accountability for driving equitable outcomes. So as we're working to increase income for older adults, we both measure dollars, have all of our participants had access to quality jobs. And Michelle, you outlined that so wonderfully. It's about family sustaining wages, about benefits, about the ability to continue to learn while on the job so that you have advancement. That is one measure. Our second measure is, have we achieved the outcome of equitable outcomes? So it's not just about access, though that's important, right? Opening up to be sure that we are serving vulnerable, low-income older adults from many, many different populations. And in fact, thinking about the intersectionality of identity, or as many people often say, and I would echo, no data, no justice. So being sure that we absolutely understand who we are serving, proportionality of identities across populations for older adults, and then doing what is often disproportionate work in our workforce programs with employers to drive those equitable outcomes. And then finally, I'll say, when we think about DEI, very few organizations include age as an identity lens, and it's very important when driving equitable outcomes, as you referenced, Michelle, to think about age and its intersection. It is no surprise that in the population we serve, many women are left most behind. These are older women, and these are women of color. So I'm happy to talk more as the conversation gets going about our specific programs and way to drive this equity in all that we do.
Thank you, Lisa. Alex?
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Lisa. It's great to be with you here today. And one of the things that strikes me is being a representative of the Society for Human Resource Management, I have the opportunity to really engage in a variety of truly unique work, in large part because SHRM has a broad vision that is really creating a better workplace for a better world. But the way we really define it internally is creating a workplace that works for all. And given what we're discussing here today, our broader vision across the foundation and what we do with our membership is really try to define what it is that organizations can do to be much more inclusive and build on a vision of inclusion for untapped talent pools. Lisa, you referenced the notion that very few organizations actually ever think about the aging workforce, but when you think about untapped talent pools, we look at those populations as well. Among those populations that we look at as we think about our constituents is really individuals who have had some sort of judicial involvement. And back in 2018, as part of our efforts to really expand our work in the inclusion space, we looked primarily at an initiative called Getting Talent Back to Work. The idea being that we would help people find their way away from recidivism through continued employment. Now, you may say to yourself, this is it sounds like a wonderful initiative, but for us, it also had a pragmatic component to it because we represent close to 1.6 million HR professionals just in the US alone, and the nearly 178 million workers that jobs that they're trying to fill on an average basis or an annual basis. So if you look at that, the pragmatic component of this was we are not going to be able to get that done with just the traditional talent pools that we identify in an annual basis or on a regular basis. So part of what we were trying to do is also serve the pragmatic purpose, which is to help make their lives and their jobs easier. If you were to look at this, though, there was a second layer of information that really struck us. When you look at this, there was no doubt that many organizations engage in diversity initiatives. They spend close to 75% of their budgets on diversity and inclusion in the diversity side, which is really the hiring side in most of their cases. What they didn't account for was really what happens after you bring someone in. And so as part of our mission through the Society for Human Resource Management, we truly felt it was incumbent upon us to equal the odds a bit and to say, let's focus on inclusion as much as we do diversity. And for that reason, we've been focused heavily on this particular initiative and broader initiatives for 5 big communities of untapped talent pools, ranging from the aging workforce all the way through to veterans and people with disabilities and beyond. So as you think about this and as you think about what role we play here, the core vision of having inclusion, equity, and diversity for us, we call it IE&D, is really focusing heavily on what we can do to tip the scales more towards inclusion. Rather than spending $3 for every $1 you spend from diversity to inclusion, let's tip the scale and go backwards and make it $3 for inclusion and $1 for diversity. So that's where we come from.
That's so great, Alex. It's that you're saying it's not just about hiring, though that's important, but how do you map the journey, the total journey of a worker? Much better returns for the employer, I suspect, as well in your research.
Without question, much better returns.
Katie, please join the conversation.
Sure. Well, it's a perfect segue. Excuse me. Sorry. My voice is a little raspy. I've had a cold. It's a perfect segue for the work that I do. My name's Katie Nielsen, and I'm the founder and chief education officer of a public benefit company called Voxy NGen. And our whole mission is to remove English as a barrier for immigrants, refugees, and speakers of other languages, because so often English is the barrier that keeps them from high value jobs that have the potential for economic mobility where they can take care of their families. And they're often left out of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. As a country, the US meets the needs of only 4% of our adult English learners. And so even if we add capacity to existing programs, which is something that we do, we help public libraries and adult education centers, community-based organizations extend their reach. The whole goal of my platform is to make English instruction accessible and personalized. It's delivered with a mobile application anytime, anywhere. It's based on decades of research on how people learn languages and how to use technology for language learning. But the important piece is getting employers to understand that they can help inclusivity by helping to upskill their workforce with English, and they can also solve their own problems because they reveal hidden talent pools. Whether you're talking about highly trained foreign professionals who end up in low wage jobs here simply because they don't have the English skills that go with their foreign credential, or limited English proficiency adults who just need English skills to be promoted to a shift supervisor or a sanitation lead role. We can help learners get the English skills they need very, very quickly and economically, which helps solve problems for employers, the problems that you're pointing out.
You know, Katie, it strikes me that that's an unbelievable example of how it works well. And especially as we look at our research at SHRM, one of the things that strikes us is we represent close to 1 million employers across the US just alone. And one of the things that strikes us is how much they create situations where they build barriers to that very kind of career advancement, economic development, and potential. Case in point, I have a dear friend who is the CHRO of a firm, a medium-sized firm out in Columbus, Ohio, and he talks about some of the issues that they ran into when trying to attract their talent from the entry-level talent all the way through to the supervisory issue. And they created policies that made it particularly difficult. They didn't have the resources. And then they changed the compensation structure in a way that it would never benefit the individual to become a supervisor, which is just pure silliness.
You know, it's so interesting. You're right, Alex. Katie, as you were talking, I was just nodding away because you're both highlighting we very often create solutions that are in search of a problem, as opposed to, as you were noting, Katie, drive into the root causality. You know, what are the needs of the employer? What are the needs of the worker? And then overcome the barriers by, you know, addressing those critical success factors. But we tend to repeat ourselves with these processes that generate results, and then we're surprised with results that should have been expected, right?
Exactly. And this particular problem is compounded by the fact that the United States is pretty horrible at language learning. Most Americans will tell you they took 5 years of Spanish and they can't say anything. So they look at English learners not as an asset. Hey, this is someone who speaks a different language. If they learned English, they could communicate with our clients and our customers. Our healthcare workers could offer care in the first language of the people they're treating. They look at it like, I have no idea how I'm going to help these people learn English. And the truth is that if you do it the right way, it works really fast. You were talking about data, and I have a quantitative research degree. My PhD is in second language acquisition. I built a platform so we could measure outcomes. Not only to measure quantitatively that learners improve their proficiency, we survey learners and collect data. Things like 88% in the last quarter were able to get a pay raise, a promotion, or a new job because they improved their English skills. And this is the message that I want employers to understand. Like, you can help solve your own problem. You can open up new entry-level jobs for people. You can promote people from within, and you can help with diversity, equity, and inclusion all at once.
Yes.
What I love about this conversation is that you're each centering the needs of the populations you serve in the work that you do. This leads to the next question that I want to ask, and that is, what opportunities do you see for increasing economic advancement for underrepresented people as we move on from COVID? Anyone?
Happy to jump in and make this a conversation, Michelle, with you and with Alex and with Katie as well. So in serving an older adult population and then all of the identities or intersection thereof, we think part of the solution is helping employers understand that age discrimination is alive and well. It goes to something that both you, Katie, and Alex have underscored, that we overlook populations who actually will bring talent diversity as well as diversity in every other way to the workplace. In fact, a study by AARP found that age discrimination costs the US over $850 billion a year. So it's just good business. I think part of the solution, Michelle, is helping employers understand the cost of continuing practices that they didn't intend to be exclusive, potentially, but that are. And that really driving into inclusion first and driving equitable outcomes is good for the bottom line. Plenty of research, some led by AARP, for example, shows that multi-generational workforces are better for the bottom line and better for employees as well. So continuing to help employers understand. But for me, the other piece is low wage jobs continue to cause difficulties, not just for the individuals in them, but for communities and for organizations. I mean, we know that families, you know, as you said in your opening, Michelle, cannot be sustained in low wage work. So let's help employers understand that offering family sustaining wages, including more individuals in the hiring and retention practices and culture, and providing things really at the center, learning at work. Don't hire always just based on a degree or learning credential that someone has. Build that into the employment journey. I think it is so important, and then have human-centered design at your core in everything you do with building a really healthy culture that helps all employers thrive and employees.
Go ahead, Alex, I think you were going to say something.
Oh, I'm sorry. What I was going to say is, you know, you mentioned human-centered design, but in reality, what I think is the most untapped skill that exists in most modern talent professionals or employers is the design thinking model, right?
Yes.
And what I think is particularly interesting is we think about it for products, but we never think about the work that needs to happen as a product. And
that's right.
And what happens to me in particular is I find that HR professionals, when they unlock that tool or that skill set that is design thinking, and they work with their business partners to identify what it is that is the solution, they immediately unlock different ways of attacking the problem. They think specifically about the skills that they might bring to bear from multiple sources to achieve the same thing that they would do if they were just trying to hire a source.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's a skill set that gets lost. And you referenced, Lisa, some of the things that we've seen. Just this last week alone, we conducted research with our omnibus panel through NORC at the University of Chicago. And one of the things we found from HR professionals and from working Americans is that they are disconnected in the way that they might attack a problem as it relates to talent, or the way that they're thinking about talent. Case in point, the biggest issue, the biggest backfill affected by COVID and the pandemic is entry-level jobs. 74% of employers say they cannot fill those jobs today.
Yes.
And the biggest barrier when it comes to filling those jobs are not issues in any way, shape, or form around finding the skills. It's the communication barriers that exist. So Katie, to your point around how we build communication skills, but also how we think about how those jobs can be filled. And HR is, I mean, not to bag on my own community, but some of it is what we do within our community, and what we do is offering solutions. We look for the easiest solution, the fastest solution, as opposed to the most creative.
Or we stay right in our lanes. So as exactly. I'm loving being with the three of you, because we're all working on issues of workforce and economic mobility, but so important across our different organizations that we're together. It's like we have to have that no silo rule when we go forward. And Alex, I'm curious, Katie and Michelle, what you think about this as well. I think there is some risk or danger in this current conversation that is now leaning back toward people don't want to work. And for me, as it relates to our work in DEI, it gets back to this fundamental challenge we have as a nation. We tend to blame vulnerable people, as opposed to saying, or we blame people who are living in poverty, as opposed to saying this is a national illness, not individual. So I think some of your solutions are great, which is, what is the job to be done as an organization? And then human-centered design, go to the populations who are overlooked in hiring and overlooked in job training. Ask them what their needs are. They will tell the employer and then design the programs that really help them thrive. But I think we're in a potentially risky time with the dialogue.
I agree. And I think part of the solution to that is not relying on what we've done in the past, not thinking about one size fits all. So
yes,
you can't take an underserved population and just say, okay, you should have these jobs. Here they are, do them. Like they're going to need resources. They're going to need support. You should figure out what those resources and support are. And often it's not as hard to get people into jobs and support them to make them successful as people think. It goes back to making sure that organizations understand what the problem is and they understand how to think about how to solve it. And you make them aware of different types of solutions that will work for different types of populations. Digital literacy is a huge one. I know it cuts across.
Yes.
It cuts across when you're talking about, age discrimination. It also happens with non-native speakers. When I talk about, hey, you should use a digital solution for this problem. Oh, well, these workers, they don't even have email addresses. Like, well, okay, so they need to get them. That's step one.
Yes.
That's 5 minutes. I can make you an email address right now and show you how to use it. So we solved that problem. So let's go to the next one. And we need to think about that, about how to give people the tools they need to get the training and support to be successful. It's not that anyone wants to be unsuccessful. They also know what it is they need to be successful.
Well, and as Alex has said, and Katie, you're underscoring, and again, Michelle opened us here, it's about seeing various individuals and populations as assets rather than a drag on the system. And so that's how one has to begin to flip this. I mean, it's not, I always say working with older adults across their identities, they're not problems to be solved, they're assets in the workforce to be leveraged. And I think, Alex, that's what you keep repeating.
So the question I have though is, who's at the table, who needs to be at the table, who's not at the table? At FHI 360, we always like to say that complex problems require complex solutions, and really bringing people to the table to help solve these. Who are the people that you would like to have at the table who are not there yet? And what would you say to get them to come to the table?
So I'm going to jump in here for a moment. And there's two things that I like to say when asked this question. And I keep in mind, I do a talk often on this, but there's 5 roles within an organization that I think are completely overlooked. And one of those key roles is the role of a workforce architect and someone who's a labor economist, right? The people who I would love to see involved are truly labor economists, because they are really talented at sourcing skills as opposed to individuals, right? And what they do is they unlock those skills to help find different sources of that talent. But I'll turn that question on its side a little bit and say, who should be at our table, right? And I'm going to use my HR hat a little bit here, because HR gets bagged on all the time. And the number one thing that HR professionals traditionally used to say was, well, I never have my seat at the table, which always drives me mad. The truth of the matter is the COVID-19 has made it put it such an imperative on talent that the question they should be asking is, how do I get you to sit at my table, not me going to your table? Now, that's my plug for HR professionals. But what I will say is, aside from that labor economy kind of mindset, I think another component is actually the timing of when people get involved in this process. Lisa, you've referenced the human design approach or the human-centered approach in terms of what people do. And what I find more often than not is we bring the stakeholders in, but it's always too late in the process. They can't influence the process. They can't influence the approach. Best example of this is the things that I've seen over the years around initiatives to help people get involved in STEM education, or to get employers to support STEM programs or corporate development programs. Well, if you say to me that you are a college or a university and you've got this STEM program and now you want me to help you kind of pull it together, it's not going to help me any. I'd rather that we co-design it, and then I can actually address a business problem along the way. Those pieces are the pieces that get lost. It's the timing as well as the right kind of people there.
Yeah, I would only add to that. I underscore everything, Alex, that you shared. But Michelle, when you're asking this question about who should be at the table, right? When we think about that in sort of a global way about increasing equitable outcomes for workforce, for good quality jobs, I think it's, as Alex said, expand the table, but most importantly, look at how the power operates at the table. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that's hard, but it means, yes, you want to be sure that the variety of stakeholders are there, workforce and potential workforce, the actual people, as Alex is saying, if wherever that table is, HR, our hiring managers, but also people work in community. So what's happening in the ground in community with organizations who are supporting good policies that support the employer and the success of that business, as well as that support the success of the workforce? You know, what is, and from a community level, I always say I have the table set right if I take time to reflect and check my blind spots.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
To really spend time to check the blind spots. And then Katie, with your expertise, I think social entrepreneurs and innovators are very important in terms of having seats at the table, because Alex, you identified it. They help us check ourselves when we say, we actually have an idea and we know what we're doing, but we're going to get the table together and have them confirm an idea. That innovation thinking or social entrepreneurial thinking helps us say, no, solutions out the door. You know, let's identify the problem and build from there.
Yeah. I really think that this also requires us to think about how we do community building, and we need to change the power dynamics at the table. You know, from the work that I've done in the past, you really have to, everyone has to be an equal at the table, and we all have to recognize what are the challenges as our challenge, not your challenge or their challenge or somebody else's challenge, but we have to own it as ours and say, this is an opportunity to help everybody. This could be my child, this could be my aunt, this could be my nephew, this could be whatever. If we see people as see their humanity and see how supporting them also supports us, we just have to think differently about how we come to the table and what we're trying to address.
I think, Michelle, that is the central issue, isn't it? And with all of your experience in this space, to be sure that voices are equal in a conversation likely means that more voices need to be there in some way, to be sure that so for the more of the workers who are left behind.
And workers to feel comfortable contributing
yes.
to the conversation. Like that gets back to Alex's point about timing. So often tables are put together once the decisions have been made and the problem has been outlined, and then someone gets brought in at the last minute to check a box, and that's not going to solve any problems. Like including people in a way where they feel comfortable identifying the problem and outline and responding to solutions and giving feedback and having really hard conversations. Like these are not easy problems to solve. And
no.
trying to correct decades of injustice, you can't just fix it, but you have to do the hard work of listening and including all the people who should be contributing and not try to get in the way of them sharing their stories. And
have the will to have a different outcome. I mean, in this conversation, I think we're also aware that, you know, these are life course issues. So necessarily so, we have workforce programs that are working on sectors, either sectors that are important to the employers or cohort groups or sectors in a population. But fundamental, we have to recognize if you're locked out of opportunity as a child, and then you're locked out of opportunity, this is a cumulative impact. So then as you are being served by AARP Foundation as an older worker, we're trying to overcome just discrimination and racism and loss of opportunity over so much time. So another hope I have is that we start to work more mutually, to think about solutions that are sticky and that truly help individuals have opportunity to have family sustaining, purposeful, meaningful work that allows them to share their contributions across the life course. Good for them, good for communities, good for employers. And it seems, but we've designed, as you said, Katie, over centuries, we're designed to get the result we're getting. So how do we as leaders in this space really require something different and hold ourselves accountable for the measurements that produce results that will be sustainable?
Yes, and when we get those results and measure them, we also need the people we're helping to tell their own stories. Like we need to have examples of people who've managed to overcome a lifetime of systemic racism and then get a better job and talk about the resources they need and talk to their own communities about what worked and what didn't work, so we can learn from what we're doing, because what we're doing now is definitely not going to what we need to do going forward. So we have a continuous cycle of evaluation of how things are going.
So Katie, I want to build on what you're saying in this comment about systemic racism and actually center employers in this next part of our conversation, because if we're going to change what's happening, it is incumbent for employers to make some changes to what they're doing. And so my question for you is, what can employers do, particularly in the areas of recruitment, outreach, retention, onboarding, training, to increase the ability of the populations that you're serving be successful? What is the employer's responsibility? What can the employers do differently that they're not doing to make sure the people that you're working with success? You know, so often our paradigm is to fix the person when really it's the environment the person is in that's a problem. So if we're going to change that environment, if we're going to address systemic racism, what is it that employers need to do differently to create a space where employees can be successful, particularly those who have not had previous success in the work environment?
So I'm going to jump in if that's okay here.
Sure.
And one of the things that strikes me is I'm going to offer some practical guidance here, in large part because, you know, Lisa, you referenced that we stub our toe over and over again. And we're designed to get the solution that we're getting, right? And it's almost foolhardy to keep going down that same path. But if I was to really give employers guidance, is number one, I'd get a subscription right off the bat to a tool that helps them access talent more broadly. And what I mean by that is, you know, an analytics platform, things like we've seen Matt Siegelman and his work at Burning Glass. We've seen other groups that do this kind of thing.
Right.
And I think it does sort of redefine the talent acquisition kind of component. In addition, I'd also advise every organization to engage in bias and sensitivity reviews of your own communications. It's fundamental, almost silly, right? But what I see over and over again is internal communications is where organizations end up creating more division or divisiveness than anywhere else, or that lack of sense of belonging, if you will. And then the third thing that I advise is, and this is based upon our research, we just engaged in research looking specifically at the employee life cycle and where it is that things like equity fall apart, or things like the sense of inclusion really fall apart. And it's, if you get onboarding right and recruitment right, you're far less likely to have that multiplicative approach, right? And organizations that do that are really focusing on intersectionality, recognizing that the Venn diagram of the workforce, you know, most people are going to get older, so they are going to feel that ageism. Most people, you know, are from diverse populations, so you have to focus on that. And our research sort of highlights that something as simple as a question asked by a recruiter can cause a sense of perceived inequity.
Right.
And if you go with that and then go to the hiring manager, and the hiring manager doesn't put enough time into that onboarding, all of a sudden you take a person who was looking forward to an employment experience to being 18 times as likely as someone else who hasn't experienced those things, 18 times as likely to leave the organization or want to leave the organization. That's telling. It's those 2 or 3 things right at the start of somebody's employee life cycle that really make a difference.
Yeah, and then how do we, bouncing off on what Alex is saying, you know, I'll challenge myself. I have a great workforce team, Mindy Feldbaum and our entire workforce team at AARP Foundation, but we have to continue to challenge ourselves to say, how do we provide accessible support for employers who need support to get things right and to be more focused on equitable outcomes. And then again, I think you such practical solutions, Alex, but how do we ensure that all of those solutions are also focused on low wage workers across, you know, all identities who are doing, you know, in the past 15 months in this pandemic, we all, I hope, valued more, and we count on essential workers, lower wage workers who are supporting our lives. So how do we turn, as you said, Michelle, that humanity into supporting employers and workers in having a better experience that relates and results in family sustaining wages as well. And then Alex, I want to underscore what you're saying for employers, just listen. Are we really listening, organizations? And are we listening to employees and understanding what their needs are so that we're using that human-centered design? It will, I'm convinced, cost less in the long run and be better for the business objectives that any organization has as well. And then could we put learning at the center and really recognize that learning takes many forms and learning is important? I mean, Katie, it's what you've developed. In fact, it's important across all of our lives to be able to have access to affordable credentialing and learning experiences that help us get the most out of really talented employees.
Exactly. And it's to make sure that those employees feel like they can tell the employer, whether it's because they need the skills to learn how to communicate in English, or they need the skills to understand how to advocate for themselves. They feel like they're in a position where they can make their needs understood, because we need to rethink the benefits we offer to employees. What we're doing now is not necessarily designed to support the needs of frontline workers, the essential workers who kept us going during the pandemic. Do we know what they need, what they would want to have as an employer benefit? I think it starts with education, but I think understanding what would help them do their jobs better is critical.
Yeah, what does flexibility look like?
Yeah. And Katie, to your point,
have you seen examples of what employers are doing, particularly with the population that you're serving, and trying to help gain the literacy skills that enable them to be more engaged within the workforce and take on new jobs in management, et cetera?
Yeah, I'm seeing forward-thinking employers working in retail, working in manufacturing, working in allied healthcare, looking at their own employees, giving them language skills, and then giving them the resources they need to be promoted from within. So we have wonderful examples of workers who worked in the back of the house with no English skills of a chain restaurant, promoted to being in the front of the house, taking orders over the phone, getting a pay raise, being promoted to being a general manager. So we see lots and lots of examples of employers who are looking at their own staff and thinking, hey, what can I do to help my staff do their jobs better, but also live their lives better? It's the intersection there that makes the real difference.
Well, that's so important. And Alex, I'd be curious about what you know about the following, which is there tends to be these internal structural barriers that go along with unconscious bias about what the good jobs gap, right? Mm-hmm. Who's an entry-level person and already tagging who gets to be promoted versus who will stay. So I'm curious, Alex, what you know about how we help employers get rid of those barriers, focus on skills development, and focus on the possibility that all employees can be promoted and have better wages.
So, you know, it's interesting that you raised that, because what we've learned is that organizations who actually engage in full relatively more robust assessment of their workers at all levels tend to be much more skilled at making or democratizing the opportunity for others, right? Those that rely on supervisory kind of perspectives never get to see the same return as those that actually just use assessments. But I do want to go back to two things that you and Katie said, one each, and really, Katie, what you were referring to is, and it stood out to me, is really the function of being much more open to who is the dialogue that we should be having, right? And when I think specifically about the dialogue that we hear over and over again in all these thought leadership pieces, all these research and insights newsletters that I get, is the return to work, and everything is about the return to work. But there's a whole 40% of the workforce that never got to leave work.
Correct.
Never. And never had any opportunity to do that. That's not an inclusive way of looking at the workforce as a whole, right? And so we don't do a great job of that. The second thing, though, was, Lisa, what you talked about with putting learning at the center. And what I think is lost is learning is not just shouldn't just be at the center. I think you captured it beautifully, but it's also reinforcing with employers that learning should not be a conditional benefit, in my mind.
That's right.
And I know it sounds very, too idealistic in some cases, but learning is the kind of thing that you want to ensure that your entire workforce has access to it. And then you see where the returns are from there. Most employers don't really focus on return on workforce investment. And I'd encourage them to learn more about that as a real guide to running their businesses.
Yeah, Alex, I'm so glad you brought that up. And we, even at AARP Foundation, because we think it is so important, we have on our dashboard, all of us have in our performance objectives, learning points that we're accountable to get. So what we say is across the whole organization, what are we doing to reinforce our own learning as well? But a lot of change has to happen there. You're right. I hope too that it shouldn't be conditional. We should care enough about the learning of all employees.
We should, and this ties into a larger picture outside too, which is that there's a huge disconnect between higher education and workforce and how we're preparing people for jobs and how we're preparing people for the jobs of the future.
That's
and
right.
We can't do that without including the employer as part of that. And when you think about removing barriers to employment, if we get rid of false constructs and education that doesn't make any sense to have as a barrier, and we think about getting good employees and supporting them and then giving them the skills they need while they're on the job and supporting their education, I would love to find a way to show the ROI on that for the employer. When you're talking about economists and thinking about the skills and the jobs, if we could build an ROI calculator for employers to see that the benefit of investing in education for their employees will pay them dividends in saved recruitment costs and retention and being able to build a culture of communication and collaboration within the workforce, that would be amazing.
Well, I think important too. Go ahead.
I think that's sorry, Lisa, but I think that we're going to have to end there. And Katie, that's a very provocative question that you've put on the table that I encourage others at the Horizon Conference to think about and think about how to operationalize if we could really do that. In closing, I'd like to thank Lisa March Ryerson from AARP Foundation, Katie Nielsen of Voxy, and Alex Alonso of SHRM for this very insightful and important conversation on equity and inclusion. I believe that as we enter this unique period of rethinking and rebuilding key aspects of our national workforce, we have an opportunity, if not an obligation, to leave behind the policies and practices associated with education, training, and employment that kept people out of the system and relegated to the margins of society. Last month, Porter Novelli published the results of their most recent business and social justice study, which considers what customers, employees, and other stakeholders including their own employers, think about issues of social justice. I'm going to leave you with the following from that study that was just conducted a few months ago in April. The report says that 64% of individuals think the past year has made their companies understand their role in addressing systemic racism. 59% of Americans say it's no longer acceptable for companies to be silent on social justice issues. 43% of employees say they are reconsidering their current job because their company is not doing enough to address social justice issues externally. And when asked how companies should take action on social justice, the top 3 responses were diversifying, hiring and promoting, establishing justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, or JEDI policies for internal change, and pushing to change government policies or regulations to make them more equitable. Thank you for joining this session. Enjoy the rest of the Horizon Conference.